Last topic is how to find, is what you need to know for Election Day, and all this information is available on our website at monroecounty.gov, Board of Elections. Quite an extensive website with a lot of information, and starting with how to find your polling site. Of course, we send a letter out to every voter every year in August telling them where their polling site is, and then we update that if there's any changes. We do with all those many polling sites. Unfortunately, sometimes something happens that a polling site is not available or not appropriate as we come closer to the election, but by state law we notify every voter who's registered in that district of the change in their polling site. But it is something that you can check very easily by going on our website to find out, just to verify where you. And we try to avoid changing polling sites, but as I say, some places become available and other places, for various reasons, become unavailable. But the vast majority of them carry on year after year. The second item would be the polling site hours. That's fairly easy this year. Or in the general election, obviously, back in April, it was a big issue with the primary, because people didn't realize in the presidential primary that it was, what do you mean it's only from noon to 9? But that's state law. There's 6 counties in the state, I believe, that were able to be open, maybe it's 8 or 9. City of New York, Long Island, Erie County. But the polling site hours here are the traditional 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., but that is important for people to know. And what the ballot looks like. You can go online and see what the ballot that you're going to be given at the polling site will look like, so that you're familiar with it. You don't get there and say, what are these races, what am I voting on, and see who is on the ballot, what names, and familiarize yourself with the ballot, and try to avoid those situations like Tom was talking about, where it says there's 4 lines, but it says vote for 3, so that you know when you get there, oh, okay, oh yeah, this is the one where I only vote for 3, or I vote for 2 out of whatever. There probably aren't any situations like that this year that are very complicated, but that is something in general too that you should always keep in mind. How to complete the ballot. Tom's talked about that, that carefully mark the circle and don't have any other marks on the ballot that could somehow render it to be not acceptable, not read by the machine properly. And then the last one would be how to put the ballot in the machine. And I think we're all, since these machines are still fairly new, trying to get comfortable with that whole concept of taking the ballot, putting it in the sleeve for security, getting it over to the machine, and then sliding it into the machine. But that's something that we don't do all that often, so it's something that's a little unusual. It's different from what we used to do years ago. But that is another thing that if you have any questions about, and you can always ask at the poll. Because besides the 2 inspectors, there's people out there on the floor that would help you with that and assist you, and usually are. I know they're always hovering over me. You know how to do that? Well, yeah, I should. So those are the concerns for at that point.
The last topic we have tonight, before questions, is we were asked to talk a little bit about election reform. And I thought a good place to start really was with the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. They actually found 4 things that they believed were really important in terms of elections and dealing with a number of issues out there. The registration process, and their whole concept is that we have to modernize that. And although they did provide a lot of ideas, online registration, stuff like that, they definitely believe that this would improve our processes out there. Measures to improve access to polling in general. This is a number of issues around this that we certainly can talk about. State-of-the-art techniques to assure effective management of the polling places. And again, there's topics there that can be talked about. And then reforms of setting standards, making sure that there are standards for election equipment and processes and what have you. But then I also want to talk a little bit about New York State, because we have, in addition to those 4 topics, we have a number of topics here that we have. We do have and should be talking about voter registration. Certainly that's a topic much like was pointed out to us. Voting systems, elections themselves and the ballot, campaign finance. That's a topic that wasn't necessarily mentioned in that program, but certainly a topic that we talk a lot about here in New York State. And then ballot access and frankly, how political parties come into this community. Voter registration. When you talk about voter registration, the conversation leads in many directions. Very often it starts out with universal registration. If not that, then same-day registration. So those 2 kind of things have cropped up, and we've had discussions about those. One of the things that possibly we should be doing right away, at the very least, is a permanent in-state registration. If in fact you register in New York State in Onondaga County, you should be registered in the state and not have to re-register again. That probably is a very logical thing to do. Another thing with registration is currently, anybody use the DMV site to update their address or registration? One of the things with the DMV site is when you go in there and you go to put your registration in for the first time, you have to opt in if you're doing a DMV transaction. One of the things or improvements that we might make with that is that we might have only an opt-out option. In other words, you're registered to vote automatically unless you opt out. It may sound like a simple thing, but probably it could change immensely the number of people that are getting to register to vote. And with technology today, maybe it's time that the Board of Elections, not necessarily us locally, but through the state board, that we actually had our own online registration system. We can reach out to DMV and get the wet signature from there. And frankly, this process might really help a lot if people could just go online. And don't get me wrong, it's almost selfishly that I might say this because it benefits us. If people do something online, it comes to us electronically instead of trying to read those cryptic pieces of paper. So there really is there is a lot of logic to that. In terms of some of the things too, and some of these things that probably I think about, David and I agree on a lot of stuff. We may have different ways of getting to them. But one of the things that I would like to see is an automatic felon re-register program when they're released from prison or from parole. I'd like to see them automatically re-registered as part of that release program, because I think that they really don't understand. They don't understand that they can do that, and that's why I think that kind of program would be important. I apologize. Shut it off. One of those things would really be important because what happens is that they don't think that they can re-register. And we got to dispel that. Well, the best way to dispel that is just to re-register them when they're coming out. And I also think in terms of voter registration, some of the social service agencies should be doing a better job of registering people to vote. And I think that we could do a lot of like the online program that DMV does, we might be able to do through the social service agency. So that's something that we could do there. In terms of voting systems, we really are about 6 or 7 years now into these voting machines, and probably we're looking at 3 more years, maybe 4 more years of life. And don't get me wrong when you say, oh my gosh, only 10 years after we got 100 years out of the last voting machines. Bear with me just a minute here. Let's see if I can do this, get through this. Getting 100 years out of the last voting machines, you think 10 years is not a lot, but to be frank with you, the technology is moving that fast that in fact new equipment really would provide us an opportunity. I've seen new equipment now where instead of going in and having your paper ballot that you fill out, you go in and you're given a little piece of cardstock, probably about this tall and about this wide. It's a little bit heavier than the paper ballot, not much. You actually walk up to the machine, you put it in the machine, you then cast your vote on the screen. Now, we get worried about this because we don't know what it's going to do. But what's interesting is that once it helps you through, it tells you not to overvote, it kind of walks you through all those processes. But then, when you get all the way to the end, it lets you know, okay, well, these are the people you voted for. By the way, you didn't vote in this race, and this and that. If you want to change something, you can change something. When you get all done, you say, yes, I'm done. Now, what it does is it hands you back that piece of paper totally filled out. You haven't cast your ballot yet. You now have a piece of paper in hand with your votes on that you can look at and see. You still have to walk over to the voting machine and stick it in. But guess what? The voting machine will read this piece of paper much better than it does reading the ones where you filled in the bubbles. Plus, you've had assistance in filling out the ballot. So, the technology is there now, and that we've seen that with several companies. And so these are the kind of things that we're looking at and talking. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. We are talking money, and it's going to cost. But again, we've got to talk about how valuable the price of democracy is and how much it means. The other thing is that we're looking at, and they're already out there, is we're looking at electronic poll books. And you may say, electronic poll books, but what good does that do? And I get a little nervous about that. No, actually, that's really a good thing. That would allow us to register people much later, because right now we spent a whole week and a half printing poll books, okay? Another half week putting them together. Another couple of 3 or 4 days getting them in the machines. It's amazing how long it takes to get this kind of stuff out to the polling site. But with an electronic poll book, the night before the election, we could download the file if, in fact, we did registration right up until the last day. The other thing is that it opens up the doorway for some other things about elections that we'd like to do. Believe it or not, wherever we've gone and wherever we've tried electronic poll books, we've actually had inspectors tell us how much they've liked them. Ah, I got it. It's gone. Yeah. We've actually had inspectors tell us how much they've liked it. We've had a few counties that have tried them out, and it's amazing, but nowadays the signature on the screen is a little bit easier. They can lay it flatter so that you can actually write on it. They work really well. They can be looked up, and guess what? If you're in the wrong polling place, they can still find you in there, and they'll know immediately where the right polling place is to go. So that's a very positive thing. It really would work well. So in terms of the voting systems, those are kind of two things that really add a lot to it. In terms of elections and the ballot, there's been a lot of discussion, about early voting across the country. 34 states and D.C. do early voting currently. There's about 7 states right now across the country that have no type of early voting. There's probably about 7 or 8 others that have some type of early voting, but it's restricted. Like New York State, if you vote by absentee, you can vote up to about 32 days before the election. But you have to be out of the county on election day, or confined to your home, ill, or a caregiver for somebody who is confined to the home. So absentees are very, very restrictive. So this whole concept about early voting probably needs to have a discussion. I'm going to tell you, I personally don't know as though I believe that 30 or 45 days in advance of election is a good time to be early voting, but maybe 8 or 14 days might be a reasonable time to look at this kind of thing. And it's a discussion we should have. One of the other things that the legislature has been toying with, and unfortunately it takes a constitutional amendment, is the a no-fault absentee, where you don't need a reason to get an absentee ballot. You can just say, I want an absentee ballot. Okay? Unfortunately, the absentee ballot is written into the New York State Constitution. And in essence, the rules about it are written into it. Talk about overkill. Unfortunately, it's going to take 2 legislatures, consecutive legislatures, with a bill to say, okay, we're going to take it out of there and put it into legislation, and the voters to turn that around. But that's certainly, if that wasn't in the Constitution, that would be a real quick way to begin to see what we could see as kind of an early voting process. The other thing you got to understand is, though, if you begin to look at these kind of changes, we also would change the hours on election day. Maybe 7 to 7 would be more reasonable. Maybe we should look at that kind of stuff in conjunction. Because I have to be honest with you, you don't do one thing without trying to look at the whole picture. That's kind of why, as I'm talking to you, I'm talking about a lot of different things you would change. But you need to kind of do a lot of them in order to make a difference. The other thing that's been discussed in New York State, two things in particular. One is the fusion voting, where a candidate can get multiple lines. And frankly, that is just so New York State. Other states just don't do that at all. And you can get maybe cross endorsements, but you get one line. And so the real question is that really to our advantage? And does that unnecessarily fill up the ballot? So now you look at the ballot that you saw up here, and it's very confusing because there's a lot of people all over the place. But I'll take it one step further. Maybe we should talk about eliminating the full-face ballot. To implement some of this new voting equipment that I just mentioned, they don't do full-face ballot because the screen isn't big enough to hold the whole ballot. Full-face ballot is where you see every single candidate for every single office at once. And New York State, again, it's so New York State, it's one of the only states now that has a full-face ballot. And so maybe we kind of do away with that so we can look at other equipment. We talk about not doing a line for every endorsement you get. Maybe those kind of things are things we should be having discussions about, because maybe it's time. You know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it might have been different, but maybe it's time. Consolidating primaries. How many people here want to say, oh my gosh, how many primaries are you going to have? It's the kind of thing that we should be dealing with. Making election day a holiday, or at the very least close the schools. There's a lot of security concerns out there. It's an issue that we really think is important and somehow needs to get done. A couple of years ago, we did a poll worker training, a poll worker program that we reached out to the various colleges, 5 of them in particular, and we were going for 6 and 7. Unfortunately, we ran out of funding. But we reached out for particularly college students to become poll workers. We had over 350 college students working as poll workers. And a lot of them stayed year after year. Even after they were out of that program, they stayed as inspectors and poll workers. We would really like to see that kind of program possibly made as kind of a state program where, in fact, we reach out. You would not believe the interest they had. We had St. John Fisher College, Nazareth College, University of Rochester, MCC, and Roberts Wesleyan College. And we were going to reach out to Brockport and to RIT. And those were the 2 that we were going to add to the program. Unfortunately, like I said, we ran out of funding. Maybe we should be exempting poll workers from jury duty. Give them a little tidbit. I mean, if you're willing to work. The other thing that we've discussed and has been discussed, and it's interesting because if you go out to the towns, if you go out to the villages, you'll discover a lot of them have nonpartisan. They have partisan elections, but they also have nonpartisan. A lot of times, people are nonpartisan who get on to the various elected offices. And to be honest with you, it's probably, we need to understand why that's happening and the kind of things that are happening there. When we talk about parties and how they come into existence, that might be something that we would want to discuss. And frankly, given that, we need to probably talk about all sorts of different voting methods and theories. There's a lot of conversation, and a lot of conversation that we're all afraid to have because we know how this works, we want to do it this way, but there's other countries and other places in the world that vote a little bit differently than we do, and we should be probably not afraid to look at that. Campaign finance reform. I mean, this is the topic in this country. It's amazing what a topic this is. There's a real movement to cut contribution limits. I mean, people want to see that. They want to see that kind of so that the smaller dollars actually go into campaigns. The transfers that go between political parties and candidates. There's a lot of concerns about that money and how that money goes out there. And that's not just related to any particular party. I stand up here as a Democrat telling you that can be problematic for a lot of things. You've heard the discussion about the LLCs and the LLPs and how partners in those can give individually, and they got individual contributions, but the money's coming out of that. And really, reform needs to be probably looked at in that. One of the things that you don't hear about a lot, but I think is an important piece, and I think would really change the whole campaign finance discussion, is that if you go on anybody's campaign financial disclosure, to be honest with you, there is a lot of ambiguous categories that don't mean a lot. And in essence, if the categories were, shall we say, a little bit more specific, and in essence pointed us in directions of how money is really being spent, Because it really is hard, anybody who goes to read those. Has anybody ever tried to read a campaign financial disclosure report from the state board? Okay, there you go, yeah. They can be very difficult to read and to make sense of. And so maybe we need to look at how the actual, shall we say, process, the pieces that are behind the reporting. In other words, I'm going to say maybe the report, maybe what's really there is okay, and we're screaming about nothing, because maybe we don't see how that money is really being spent. There's a lot of discussion going on about the specific items that candidates can get reimbursed for. Probably that's a discussion we should have. Independent committees, there's a lot of discussion about that, and I don't think that either side really believes that adds to the dialogue or that adds to the discussion. Having those independent committees out there spending excessive amounts of money to promote their candidate. Unfortunately, this will also require federal legislation, but it's something we really should be looking at. The other thing is we should consolidate. Some campaign financial disclosures come to us, some go to the state board. Maybe it's time to put them all at the state board. This way they're all in one location, everybody is online then instead of just some. And then this way, any searches you do in terms of contributors or expenditures or stuff like that will come up in your search. And we really do need to have a sincere and honest discussion about public campaign financing. It's something that it's out there. It's almost sometimes the elephant in the room. A lot of people kind of get, I don't want to talk about it because their preconceived notion about what it is or about how it's going to work. It really is something that probably needs to be discussed. And the last topic that I want to talk about a little bit is ballot access and political parties. Designating petitions. This is what gets candidates on the ballot for most parties. And to be honest with you, that process needs to be updated. It is antiquated as can be. It creates problems for candidates, and really, we could streamline that process. Right now, if you go in and you look at the law, the difference between independent designating petitions and independent petitions, petitions for the independent parties, the ones that aren't constituted parties, is different. And the law, frankly, if you just go follow the law and don't follow the court cases, you'll get yourself all fouled up. Because right now, for example, with the designating petition, anybody who belongs to that political party in the state can carry a designating petition for any candidate. But the law says, oh, no, you have to live within the jurisdiction of the person you're carrying for. Well, frankly, don't get me wrong, but when I was a leader up in the Northwest, a Democratic leader, my committee was very good at carrying petitions. We got out door to door and got our petitions done. Greece is a big town, and they always had trouble with their committee having enough people. And my committee, when they got done, would go over to Greece and help carry their petitions. And so you're going to get that kind of thing going on. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because in essence, your community working together. But in essence, the way the law is written, it would have created problems. But the courts realize that, and again, taking away some of the restrictions, taking away some of this nitty-gritty stuff that really doesn't need to be there, they got rid of it. But it's still in the law. We haven't gotten around to getting out of the law yet, which is really problematic. Constituted parties. Does anybody know, anybody know what a constituted party is?
You have to have 50,000 votes.
Right.
Governorship.
And I'll repeat that, anybody can put, through passing petitions, can put a ballot line for governor. If you get 50,000 votes on that line, you become a constituted party. Now, as I go back to fusion voting, that's the cross endorsement thing, a lot of parties become constituted parties because they grab the major party candidate and put them on their line. So now, what it means to be a constituted party is you have a signed line on the ballot for 4 years. And frankly, sometimes that's crazy, because you really aren't really a party. My logic is that I don't want to make it harder for parties to become parties, constituted parties. I don't want to say, okay, let's raise it to 100,000. Let's get rid of fusion voting. Let's say you can only become a constituted party if you have your own candidate. And I'll tell you what, I'll lower it to 30,000 or 25,000 votes statewide. Now, some of my counterparts will say to me, "Oh, are you crazy? We'll have 1 million constituted parties." But you know something? Maybe we should put in other rules. And the other rules should be, okay, you become a constituted party, but by the end of your first year, you have to have 25,000 voters statewide or 30,000 voters statewide to prove that you're really a party and not just a one issue for that election party. So, and let me tell you, these concepts, people aren't even talking about them. But we got to have this conversation. We got to talk about how we reform elections and make them better, make them work for people, because people are really concerned about them. And kind of one little thing that's always kind of gnawed at me, is anybody here a member of the Independence Party? Formally? I want that name back.
Yes, really.
Okay? So many people that I've spoken to over the last 4 or 5 years think that they didn't register with a party, they were registering independent. Right? Right? Isn't that right? And so I think we've got to be very careful about names we allow parties to take. And I want that name back because I don't think it should be out there as a name like that. But let me tell you, talk about challenging the process. As you can see, I don't necessarily give you my opinion on a lot of this stuff, but I think this is the dialogue that we need to be having. When you talk about New York State, when you talk about the country, this conversation is being had in places. I mean, don't get me wrong, but, you know, early voting is in some of the most conservative states there are. So it's not like this is a conservative or liberal discussion, okay? A Democrat or a Republican discussion. It's not. It's the kind of discussions that we need to be having, and I think the kind of discussions that will really be a good change to our election process. Hopefully we've given you some perspective, and I think now we're open for questions. David, do you want to join me? Questions? Yes.
How old do you have to be election inspector, or is there a difference between election inspectors and poll workers, and how old?
I use the term poll workers as a generic term because there's site chairs and there's actual inspectors and there's coordinators, there's all sorts of things. You have to be a registered voter.
I'm sorry, you have to just.
A registered voter.
A student asked me that. I said, I just have to be 18.
18. If you have to be registered to vote.
All right.
And that was neat about that program. Every one of those students registered within one of the two parties. We actually made the school, each school had, the way that college program worked, each school had 2 students who were fellows, and they actually were responsible for finding half of the 50, 25 each, and getting them, and then they had to schedule them, and they had to get them into training, they had to get them into the bowl. It was really a great thing, and it worked really, really, really well. So yeah, no, that's, and I really encourage that. I'd love to see that, so. Yes?
I have a question about poll watchers. Poll watchers have to be sent there by either, one of the 2 major parties. So
Yeah.
what happens in a primary?
In a primary, 2 candidates can sign the poll watcher certificate.
2
Candidates.
So if someone is running against the party endorsed candidate, they still get,
They can have a poll watcher in a
watchers.
primary. Yes, that's it for a primary. Yes.
There was a lot of interest in some of the primaries this year, and as an election inspector, we found cases where people had changed their party and they came in and they wanted to vote in this new party and discovered how long the deadlines are,
Mhm.
up to perhaps a year before you actually change. Is there any thought of changing that to shorten the?
I don't even think we can begin to have that discussion until we have these other discussions. And the reason I say that is that if in fact you could change your party kind of on a whim or in a very short period of time, if suddenly the Democrats wanted to take over a particular party for a particular race, they just make a whole bunch of people change and go vote in that primary, and then they change back. I mean, and that's the kind of thing you'd have. You have people party hopping all over the place. This is to prevent people from robbing the smaller parties of the right to choose their own candidates. And until we can fix this whole other process, the concepts of fusion voting and stuff like that, I think that's a very dangerous a very dangerous direction to go in, because it'll make the whole situation even worse, because then the battle is about who can steal which party the most.
How does that work in other states then that have open primaries? I mean, what's the experience of that been?
It's interesting that, I mean, the experience of that has been, from what we can see, it usually doesn't make a lot of difference unless you have a high-profile campaign, because a lot of times people aren't really interested in the local party politics. There has to be a real issue going on. Given that, and I'll be very frank with you, that's one piece of reform that I feel very strongly about. I don't believe in open primaries. I don't believe in open primaries at all. As a matter of fact, I really believe, if anything, we should begin to hold parties accountable and responsible for a platform that they believe in and stand on, and to provide us with candidates that live up to that platform and deliver on that platform. Because everything is so questionable nowadays, it's almost like, wait a minute, who does what? And that's the kind of thing I think that is problematic. If in fact a party had a platform, a solid platform, and something you could trust in, and they put forth candidates, not every point is going to be perfect, but put forth candidates that they're going to support that platform and stand by it, then you could begin to kind of maneuver through this mess of who's going to do or what, or how they're going to do it, or what have you. But I am adamantly opposed to open primaries because of that very reason, because I think what it does is it just makes that whole situation worse. And it doesn't prove to be any better. There's definitely circumstances where a political party is not putting forth their best candidate, or the candidate that they really want, when there's open primaries. Yes?
You mentioned the fact that our system, because we have the optical scanning, that there's not tied to any other national system. What about the states where they have just electronic machines, and I know in the past they've been able to be maneuvered or hacked or something?
I think there's about 24 states like that, if I have my number right, that have some sort of just electronic machines, and a lot of them have combinations. For example, I think in Florida you can vote on an electronic machine or by paper, your choice. You get to choose. Initially, I was very concerned when HAVA first was passed in the first couple of years, and I don't know, I mean, this group seems to be, I can say this because I'm a little bit older, this group seems to be old enough to remember back to that point in time. When HAVA was first passed, a lot of states said, oh, okay, we got to fix this, and they ran out and bought new equipment. Well, it wasn't equipment that had been tested or had the kind of the feeling of time and understanding of what our concerns were, the security was. And we went through a lot in 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a number of states bought this equipment. Oh no, this doesn't work, threw this away. Let's buy this equipment, threw this away. I think Florida, and I hate to bring them up, I feel bad because they're really trying hard to do a good job now. And I've talked to their superintendent of elections in Broward County several times. But that first 5 years was a nightmare. And